Okay, so today, most of you actually left off a few slides past this, but I had one class that stopped kind of at this point. So I'm going to kind of pick up here. So the first little bit might be kind of redundant, but it shouldn't be too bad. So essentially, when we're talking about kind of the issues between Massachusetts and Virginia, you're looking at the different ways that that the United States develops, its kind of identity. I've mentioned before, this is kind of like the DNA, if you will. But Massachusetts in particular, because of their tendency to punish people who disagree with them, they're going to, in and of themselves, create more colonies. Now, these are much smaller colonies. We talked about how Virginia, the extra indentured servants, are part of who settles in Maryland, in addition to some transplants from England. But we see where Massachusetts, in particular, is going to have issues because the nature of Calvinism is such that they encourage people to, have a relationship with God on their own, study the Bible on their own, that kind of thing. It's essentially education. And one of the challenges with education is that people begin to think for themselves. So you have a number of people that start to develop their own concepts about how the church should function, about how government should function, and about really the relationship with God. And this is going to tend to, like I said, create some offshoot kind of colonies. Thomas Hooker goes after Connecticut, and of course his big issue was he felt that the church in Massachusetts had become too closed off, too restrictive, wasn't open to enough new members, had a concern about people's eligibility to vote. So that's where Connecticut comes from. You're going to see that Roger Williams is going to create Rhode Island, mostly because he wants a separation of church and state. He thinks that there should be no connection between the two, this control of the Massachusetts government by the church, by the Congregationalists, is actually corrupting the church and making things worse. And there's more that I could tell you that you don't need to know. Just suffice it to say that that was a big issue. And then for him, the other big issue is the treatment of Indians. This is going to happen around the time of the Pequot War. And I've already mentioned, I believe in most of the classes, that the Puritans that from Massachusetts were not particularly kind to the Indians. They had no interest in Christianizing them. They basically saw them as savages and not worthy of being there. The expectation was that God had created that part of why so much of this land had been didn't have Indians on it was because God wanted the Puritans to be there. And so when they ran into Indian tribes farther inland, their attitude is, well, you're supposed to move. This is what God wants. And Roger Williams says, no, you can't do that. And so he creates Rhode Island. Anne Hutchison is an interesting story. I've told a couple of the other classes a little more detail about her being kind of a woman that stood up to the Congregationalist church about her beliefs about God and about teaching. And they end up, forcing her to leave because she... and there's the two classes that heard this story know there's a little more to it than this. There's a little more of a saga. But in a nutshell, she kind of refuses to stop teaching people that come to her to be taught. And they don't like that because she's a woman and women aren't supposed to teach men. And they basically say, you have to leave. And so she gets kicked out. And ultimately will be killed by Indians because you have this tense relationship between the Puritans and the Indian groups. And so this is kind of one of the factors of why you have frequent Indian attacks in Massachusetts during the 1600s. In fact, and I've mentioned this to the two classes that heard it, that got to this point, that it was these Indian attacks that helped create kind of the helped create the framework for kind of the Salem witchcraft trials. These young girls had witnessed some Indian attacks, and it's all due to the fact that the Puritans were pretty awful to them. So you want to just kind of keep this expansion in mind, and that this is the result of church problems. So you can kind of see where, church problems and government problems do result in people moving out and going to different places. The Pequot War is going to be where the Pequots had been a large tribe in Massachusetts, and of course, because the Puritans aren't nice to them, they attack them. And you read the document where they essentially tried to justify their vicious attack against these Indians, and it was pretty horrible. Like I said, they set fire to it and then killed everybody that ran out. And so there's a lot of critique of the Puritans for this, especially since England in particular was trying to claim they were somehow better than the Spanish because of the black legend that Las Casas had told us about in those conquest documents. And so I think that really kind of helps you get a better idea of the framework of English and Indian relations. And then these are just a couple pictures. This particular engraving is actually from the time period about the Pequot War. Push factors for colonial settlement. This is where at least one of the other classes kind of left off. And we've already kind of addressed this, where the Stuarts were, the chaos with them, the takeover by Cromwell leads to this huge question of people being in control and the benign neglect. The other thing that I want to be sure and point out is that we had navigation acts and enumerated articles in place. Remember mercantilism, this idea of bringing in raw materials into England, making stuff, and then sending the finished products out, are absolutely what what colonies are all about. That's what England's trying to accomplish, and so they try to pass laws to control the shipment of goods, in large part because the colonists like to sell their stuff to the Caribbean. Remember, the Caribbean sugar islands are dominated by slaves and sugar plantations. They don't grow their own food. And so the American colonies become the resource for those Caribbean islands. And so England doesn't like them selling to them. They don't like them selling to France and Spain. So they try to control it. And this really comes down to money. And I've mentioned before, it's the Board of Trade that really governs the colonies. The issue here is that they don't consistently enforce them. In fact, there's many years where they don't enforce them at all. And as the example I've used, it's like having a dress code that you don't enforce. As long as you don't enforce it, everyone's like, yeah, it's no problem, piece of cake, right? But then when it starts being enforced, all of a sudden everyone thinks it's awful, and this is an overreach of authority and all this kind of stuff. Well, it's very similar to the Navigation Acts, and that's what we'll see happening as we move towards the Revolution. And then the proprietary colonies that I already kind of told you about. One thing I want to kind of mention about the Caribbean, I already said that they, were dominated by sugar plantations. England and Spain are the two main powers in the Caribbean. They kind of take turns controlling various islands. And until you really had the 1580s and Spain really getting control of that region, you had a lot of pirates there. So in those, early 1500s, this is kind of where we get this notion of the pirates of the Caribbean. And sugar is becoming extremely profitable. In many ways, it's more profitable than tobacco because there's such a huge demand for it. And this all ties into kind of larger global exploration, because you have coffee and tea being discovered, becoming a common piece of kind of the European diet, particularly the English diet. And we all know that coffee and tea taste better with a little sugar. And so this idea of the sugar processing started from the Dutch, and very quickly the English adapt that. I've said many times before that the big strength of the Europeans, particularly the English, is to take other people's good ideas and make them better. And so that's what they do with sugar processing. Initially tried to use native people, but the sugar processing is incredibly dangerous and labor intensive. And so what you're going to have are is African slavery. And so they have very harsh slave codes in the Caribbean, largely because there are so many African slaves there. And so you have kind of this creation of a slave system. This is the slave system that will be imported into the southern states and the southern colonies. And so you're going to see that the wealth that people get from the sugar is going to make people in England say, hey, we would like to go somewhere else. So they start looking for someplace that has a similar climate as the Caribbean so that they can grow more sugar. And this is where we end up with Carolina. Carolina was initially a proprietary colony, but friends of Charles II, who had, in the Restoration period, had come back. He essentially gives this to his friends who had kind of helped him out, and they'll split it up. By 1729, though, they're kind of out, and this is in the early 1700s is when Great Britain starts taking over the colonies one by one until they're all royal colonies. And what will happen pretty quickly is that while at first it's all one thing, and it's just Carolina, it will soon become North and South Carolina because there's some significant differences regarding agriculture. South Carolina is very similar to the Caribbean, whereas North Carolina becomes very similar to Virginia. And in fact, North Carolina has a lot of people from Virginia there. And so you've got a real difference in culture based on the fact that the agriculture is different, their systems are different. So just know that this is kind of where Carolina comes from, particularly South Carolina and its unique nature. You're going to see that the slave codes come to North America, as well as the Southern planter culture. This kind of sense that these planters are like nobles, if you want to say. Over in, sorry, it's my dog. The door rang. So you have the Southern planter culture emerging, and so they're very much going to become the power structure in South Carolina. And so that's where kind of these southern states develop their unique characteristics. And South Carolina was really harsh. That's another reason why you have so much slavery existing in South Carolina, because it's so difficult for the English to settle there. The seasoning process is so bad. And South Carolina is really going to struggle with Florida and with the tribes, the Yamasees. And so this is going to slow down the development of South Carolina. That's part of why it's very much, it just doesn't have the level of population, for example, that you see with the other colonies. So just kind of know that there's several factors at play there. New York, the Dutch had been in charge of New York. They kind of basically say, okay, colonies are not worth the trouble. And you have kind of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, because you had a few European conflicts happening. And the Anglo-Dutch Wars were tied to trade. So the Dutch West Indies Company goes bankrupt, walks away, and the English get New York. And they start off at first, it kind of belongs to the king and the Duke of York. And so they will step in. They try to encourage the Dutch to continue, living there and all that kind of stuff. So you have a significant Dutch minority, rather. And in fact, that's why you see a lot of Dutch names and that kind of things in New York. And of course, the Dutch had their own plantation system that wasn't tied to slavery necessarily, but very clearly some of the best land had already been taken by the Dutch. New York ends up being a very diverse population because of the merchant business. And as I've mentioned before, this will include slaves. And he will begin to sell off New York in more pieces. It was actually much bigger at once upon a time, and then he sells off more of it until it becomes like New Jersey, that kind of thing. Not New Jersey, but some of the other farther west, that kind of thing. New Jersey, the lords that had Carolina sell the land to the Quakers. The Quakers were perceived as very strange by the Protestants. And so what will happen is that New Jersey will very quickly be overrun with people from New York and that kind of thing. And so the Quakers won't have a dominant presence in New Jersey. They'll settle in Pennsylvania. What will happen is that William Penn, who's a Quaker, will become the proprietor. He will use his money and wealth to kind of buy Pennsylvania. And the Quakers are very different. They tended to emphasize not just the Bible and Bible literacy as being important, but rather kind of an emotional connection with God. They talked a lot about kind of that inner spirituality, but they believed that, when you had a real connection with God, you would shake and quake, and that's where we get the term Quakers, right? There's no ministers, there's only lay people, so they don't believe in kind of any kind of traditional church, Presbyterian system, and they also don't have a problem with gender. Women can teach just like men can teach. They're totally opposed to slavery. So, yes, I put on here that's kind of why people think they're strange. And remember, it's the Quakers that the Puritans really drive out of Massachusetts because they can't handle this, women can teach and all that kind of stuff. So the Quakers will be very persecuted. This is where Pennsylvania comes from. And you can see, you have West New Jersey, East New Jersey. Those are areas that kind of come from this selling off of parts of land to the guys, to the Quakers and stuff. So Pennsylvania becomes its own place. The king is pretty happy to let them have it because, by this time you've got, tensions with the Puritans as well and that sort of thing. And the wealthy Quakers who want to escape England come here. Philadelphia will emerge as kind of a very well-planned city, planned by the Quakers. It's kind of for its time was the peak of kind of architectural planning, that sort of thing. And they do buy their land from the Indians. They don't have slavery. They only have trial by jury. They have, many different people have a right to vote regardless of religion. So very kind of liberal, open-minded city in a lot of ways. Delaware will emerge from Pennsylvania. There's kind of some shady dealings with some Indians on that. And that's kind of where Delaware comes from. William Penn will die in debtor's prison, having spent all of his money on Pennsylvania. Georgia is, they kind of create Georgia because they want that buffer zone with Spain, with Spanish Florida, and to kind of prevent the Yamassees from pestering South Carolina because of the sugar that's there, right? Because this is where these plantations are. And so they decide to use this for the people in the debtor's prison because they still have way more of those than they know what to do with. So if you know anything about kind of like Australia, Australia is founded with the same purpose, right? We're going to take people out of the prisons and dump them there and let them figure it out. And so James Oglethorpe establishes Georgia for this whole purpose. The idea was that these people would be transported to Georgia and have some land and that kind of thing, and this would keep them out of trouble. The issue, though, is that, that they get greedy and they want to sell the land. And when people want to buy the land, they want to buy way more land than that. And they want to have slaves, right? Because Georgia is hot and it's going to be good for things like sugar and indigo and rice and all that. And so they try to limit these plantations, but it fails because it is similar to Carolina. And so you'll end up with all these plantations. You'll have lots of development in Georgia. And again, that puts pressure on the Indians and will create tensions. And there's actually kind of a whole side story with the Creek and the Cherokee during this period that we don't really have to focus on. Just know that Georgia expansion does create some problems. You tend to have clashes with the Indians regardless of where you're at. And it's because of the territory, right? Because the Indians perceive that this is their territory, they shouldn't take it from them. And the English tend to have a sense of entitlement that, well, you're not using it. God intends for us to have it. And just this general sense of superiority. And of course, it's not helped by the fact that many of these Indian tribes want to engage in trade. Now, often they want to engage in trade so they can try to manipulate Native American politics, right? At first, particularly, they don't see a threat with the British. But even once they begin to realize the British may not be as positive as they'd hoped, or that they're here to stay or whatever, you still have individual tribes that engage with the British in order to kind of get a leg up on the other. So there's real sense of kind of fracturing of these tribes. And the British and then later the Americans, of course, do a really good job of developing this and kind of exploiting it. And so you've got the Beaver Wars. We've mentioned that already. You end up with King Philip's War in New England. This is another war that happens in the late 1600s. That's part of the Wampanoags, that sort of thing. And so again, these Wampanoags that had helped the Pilgrims initially are the ones that try to basically stop English expansion, and of course it fails miserably. And that Metacom, who's known as King Philip to the English, is really, they end up getting soundly defeated. And so this is kind of the last of the big kind of attempts by the eastern tribes to really stop this, or at least the northeastern tribes. You're going to continue to have skirmishes in the southern area, probably until, after you get probably till the mid 1700s. I'm trying to think. I can't think of any particular really noticeable ones, although you do have the Seminoles tend to periodically cause problems. The biggest issue with the Indian tribes in the South is that they often provide a haven for escaped slaves, and that's going to infuriate the southern colonies and the southern states. And they continue to do that for decades. So that's going to be a real issue. Just a little bit about Bacon and Berkeley. In past years, sometimes I go into a lot more detail about this. But this year, I feel like I wanted to focus on 12 Years a Slave and kind of that part of the story. So I didn't want to go into a whole lot. You do need to know Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, 1677. We've already established that this rebellion, this tension with the indentured servants, is what leads to the expansion of slavery. And another aspect of this is the idea of a frontier, that we need a frontier to have opportunity, that when people feel like they're being denied the chance to fully have the same opportunities, they tend to get really angry. And I've mentioned before that this is really kind of, if we're talking about what's in the DNA of U.S. history, this kind of populism, this kind of revolt by ordinary people, or even less economically advantaged people, because they feel like their opportunity's been taken away from them, is very much what Americans do. So whether you're talking about the Tea Party or Donald Trump or the populists of the 1800s, you often have people that get really upset because they feel like they're not having a voice. In Berkeley's case, right, in Berkeley and Bacon's case, Berkeley was married a wealthy woman, gains a lot more land. He already had some land, but he gains even more. He's the governor, so he's getting lots of money. In fact, the governor in Virginia, and this is true in many of the colonies, the governor does not get paid from the crown. The governor gets paid from whatever the local assembly or local kind of representative government is, and they take what they're selling, and they take a portion of that profit and they give it to the governor as a way of saying, oh, thank you for your service, right? So I tell you that so you know that Berkeley benefits from having, first off, peaceful relations from the Indians, because Indian conflicts are bad for business. They burn tobacco, and then people lose tobacco, and there's not as much tobacco to sell. He also benefits from selling tobacco because he gets a portion of that, of what's collected, to serve as his pay for being the governor of Virginia. And so you kind of need to know that he's got this connection with the way the politics of the time are working, particularly in Virginia. Bacon comes in. He's a distant relative of, I think, Berkeley's wife. And he comes in. He's, when he thinks he wants to buy land, and the only available land is way out on the frontier. And he's really upset about that, because he says, this isn't fair. I'm too far away. I won't be able to be in politics. I mean, Bacon really has this vision that he's going to be, the next big thing. He's going to be the next big leader of Virginia. And so he kind of starts making a lot of noise, being very critical with Berkeley. And he gets some guys and gets them stirred up, and they start creating problems with the Indians. And then he says, well, see, clearly Berkeley's not controlling the Indian population, and he uses this as an excuse to kind of march on Jamestown. Berkeley gives him a position on the governor's council. Bacon says, okay, fine, I'll be happy. Tells his followers, yes, I'll speak up for us. And then decides that that's still not enough. So again, they get together. They stir up more trouble with Indians. They start marching, burning plantations, and all that kind of stuff. And you end up with a real conflict between Berkeley, who represents kind of the government of Jamestown, the royal government, Berkeley, who represents the landed interests, those that had been there a while, the ones that were closest to the James River, closest to the Atlantic Ocean, and he represents those elites, whereas Bacon represents the newcomers, the ones that haven't been there very long, that don't own as much land, that are really kind of struggling to really have a big role to play in the government, because they can't compete economically or politically with the established people. And so you kind of, like I said, you kind of see this trend of upstarts being really upset at the established systems. Now what will happen is that Berkeley will go in, he will burn Jamestown down. He ultimately dies of some combination of like dysentery and typhoid. He gets horribly ill because it's Virginia and he hadn't been there that long, and there's all kinds of little diseases that float around in the swamp, and he gets sick and dies. And so the question that we have when we're talking about Bacon is, what was he really trying to get? Historians still debate this over and over again. Was he really standing up for the common man? Is that why he decided to go back to Jamestown? That he felt like they were ignoring him on the council? Or is this more having to do with he was just a little bit crazy and he just, liked the press he was getting, liked the attention, and couldn't stop while he was ahead, if you will? We don't know. Like I said, historians continue to debate this. But I do think it's interesting to realize that Berkeley did try to give him what Bacon initially said he wanted, which was land that was closer to the James River, which was a position on the governor's council, but that ends up not being enough for him. And so it really kind of shakes up the colony a little bit. And of course, it's after this that you have the resurgence of, not even resurgence, you have the further entrenchment of slavery as a labor system. So these things all kind of build together to make Virginia different. You do see one of the other aspects of Bacon's rebellion is they do pass some laws, thanks to him, that are meant to give people with less land more of a say in the government. Because one of the things that was happening is you had former indentured servants settling for less land. And the big problem there was that they didn't own the required amount to actually be able to vote. So when they changed the laws, they allowed those guys to have more of a say. So you definitely see that there's kind of this, we better acknowledge that these ordinary people want to vote, want to do something with the government. And so that's one of the results of Bacon's laws. And again, whether that was truly his intent or whether that's just the elites of Virginia saying, gee, we don't ever want this to happen again. It's a good lesson to learn for modern politics, whether or not, politicians, when they promise to make changes that people are demanding, are they really making the changes that need to be made, or are they simply doing the minimum possible to keep everybody happy and quiet? And this is where we really switch to the role of slavery, which we've talked about already. So the last thing we have is consolidation. Lack of regulated trade begins to be resolved. They have a kind of a new set of navigation acts in 1660 when the Stuarts come in and maybe the dust starts to settle a little bit. There's some attempt by the Stuarts to consolidate all of New England. Remember the tension with the Protestants, right? But that doesn't work. The Dominion of New England falls flat because the colonials get too upset with this. So again, another example of how the colonial system was very independent. And then the Glorious Revolution. When William and Mary come in, Parliament becomes supreme. And this is where the Board of Trade comes in, the Vice Admiralty courts that control, the Admiralty controls shipping, right? So when somebody does something, really breaks a serious law, they go to the Vice Admiralty courts, not to just a regular judicial system. And the Board of Trade tries to regulate things. But what we begin to see is that even though royal control is having some attempts by fits and starts to increase, the colonial representatives still very much control control what's happening at home. So yes, they have these navigation acts, but they're still not being enforced consistently. And part of this is because of the chaos with the Stuarts. And it's really the colonial representatives that are the ones in charge. And remember, most of these places, the whatever kind of representative assembly or what that they have in place really kind of controls what the governor gets paid. So in that sense, the governors are not completely independent from the colonists. And so that gives the colonies a great deal of power in a lot of ways. And it's interesting to think in terms of that because really is British control so bad? One of the common lessons we learn as little kids is how terrible Britain was to the colonists, and were they really? Maybe the colonists are just all about throwing a big temper tantrum because they're finally being told, no, these rules really do exist and we're really going to enforce them now. Along the same lines as when the dress code is enforced at school or the cell phone policy is enforced at school. And it's not that the rules are new. It's just somebody's now saying, well, wait a minute, you can't do this. So I think that that's pretty interesting. You have increasing tensions with the French and English. You have several imperial wars, and we don't have to worry about the ins and outs of those imperial wars. Just know that until you get to the 17 teens, the French and English are kind of sniping at each other, for lack of a better term. And the Indians are going to kind of be caught in the middle. And so they're going to struggle in this process. And this is part of why, even though they have this attempt in the 1660s to control the colonies more, this is why it doesn't quite work the way they intend. Because you've got 20 years of craziness, with the imperial conflicts and stuff. And so they aren't able to really keep an eye on what's happening in the colonies. And the colonies are really doing whatever they want to do. So you just need to kind of see, I have this synopsis here of the politics of it. The big issue is that we go from this craziness of the Stuart period, we have neglect of the colonies, to where once the William and Mary come in, and then Queen Anne, and then later the Hanovers, you have, especially as you start moving into the Hanoverian monarchy, you have a lot more focus on the colonies, what's going on there, who are they trading with, who are they not trading with, and some of these issues become very, very pressing. And certainly once the Hanoverians come in, the issue about religion becomes really kind of null and void. So suddenly this conflict that had really shaped so much of the early expansion of the colonies, whether you're talking about Massachusetts and the Puritans disagreeing, or whether you're talking about the proprietary colonies and kind of how New York gets fractured off and how Pennsylvania gets fractured off, these tensions cease to exist. So one of these things that created the number of colonies that we had is not relevant. And so all that's left, especially once these imperial conflicts go away, is going to be this sense of kind of, how do we solidify royal control? And so that will become increasingly the issue as we move closer to the American Revolution. So this leaves us with colonial America around 1700. And, hopefully you kind of were able to follow. I know I'm talking really fast and trying to do this at home with distractions. So, I hope that the colonies made sense. The big thing is that you know about the proprietary colonies, and you know the impact of religion, and you can understand what I mean when I talk about what's inherent in kind of U.S. history, whether you're talking about freedom of religion or kind of the Bacon's Rebellion, populism stuff, or whether you're talking about the family values and Puritanism of Massachusetts, and even the tendency at times to not be very tolerant, to be very resentful of free speech, very resentful of freedom of religion. These things don't appear out of nowhere. So as we're in 1700, here are the colonies as they existed, with Massachusetts kind of having this weird split colony, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. And you can see kind of the position of France, New Spain. And I kind of typed in a little bit, although apparently I misspelled remnants. I typed in kind of where the Indian tribes were to give you a little bit of a sense for what we're talking about. That's not an exact location. That just kind of lets you know, so that if it ever comes up, and randomly, that you can see that. So that's it for expanding the colonies. Only like 34 minutes, so not terrible. I'll be recording Developing Colonial Regions, and that one will be very important. This one's really just background. The Developing Colonial Regions is the one that helps you understand how we get from where we are in 1700 under, badly enforced navigation acts, coming off of benign neglect and kind of the sense that, England doesn't care what we do as long as they get their money, to suddenly you having, committees of correspondence and the Sons of Liberty, and you having all this noise being made about independence and questioning the rule of the king. So that's it, and thank you for listening.